Guadalupe is everywhere. Emblazoned on a protest banner carried at the head of the United Farm Workers protests, she's seen as a symbol of justice. Painted on Miguel Hidalgo de Castillo's revolutionary standard, she is seen as a symbol of nation. On an advertisement for Banamex, a major bank in Mexico, she is seen as a symbol of economic prosperity. Printed on a 40 Days for Life bookmark with the caption, "God is pro-life, are you?" She is seen as a symbol of sexual and bioethical morality. Rendered as a curvy Chicana with dark brown skin, draped in bright colored flowers, she is seen as an assertion of sexual empowerment. Guadalupe is everywhere. But what does that mean? What does she mean? Writing about Guadalupe in the pages of America magazine several years ago, I asserted that Guadalupe's meaning is contested. And I was surprised, although I perhaps should not have been, when some of the readers angrily responded to my article and said, her meaning is not contested, it's clear, it's enduring, it's forever. But as we've seen the examples above, her image has been leveraged to advance myriad social, political, and economic causes. And while many devotees to La Virgen de Guadalupe would like to imagine that her symbol is simple and straightforward and renders an unambiguous theological and moral message, these illustrations of Guadalupe's multiple interpretations reveal that debates about her meaning are far from settled. The task of those devoted to her symbol, and scholars alike then, is to do the difficult work of discerning modes of interpretation that do justice to her symbol and its narrative, including Juan Diego, who is, of course, an integral part of this story of encounter. As you are already likely aware, important cultural and academic debates are underway about what her symbol might mean for topics such as economic justice and sexual morality, and even thinking about the pandemic and what we owe each other in terms of the common good. In colonial Mexico, Guadalupe was often prayed to during the epidemics that happened there, and thus her healing power, the symbol of her healing power, is also relevant to us today as we sit on opposite sides of the country and yet are all wearing have our masks nearby because we are sharing the same pandemic. And I've also written, as Jeffrey mentioned, about the political significance of her symbol in my recent book. But a new and crucial conversation about interpretation of her symbol is beginning to come to the foreground of our conversation, and that is the significance of her symbol in terms of race. For Mexican Americans and Chicanas, Guadalupe has long been a banner of dignity, the dignity of brownness, giving visual representation to the beauty of darker skinned Mexican and Latinx people, even as we've been despised often in American societies. Some of the forerunners of Latinx theology, most notably Virgilio Elizondo, predicated their theological interpretations of her symbol as La Mestiza, a mixed race woman whose beautiful brown face promised racial and cultural reconciliation amid enduring racial and cultural marginalization in the United States. But in his 2009 monograph called Mestizaje, Remapping Race, Culture, and Faith in Latino Catholicism, Nestor Medina raises crucial questions about the adequacy of the reconciliatory interpretation of Guadalupe. He argues that this interpretation elides or erases the tendency of her image to be used in favor of promoting a whitened Latinidad, of a racial identity which is suspicious of both indigenous and Black identities, of a whitened conception of Latinx identity that renders Black and indigenous identity virtually invisible. A text that is at least a decade ahead of its own time, Medina's argument prophetically gestured to the conservative political shift among US Latinx people during the 2020 elections this past year, catalyzed by an ever greater identification with whiteness and a growing antipathy toward the cultural, economic, political, and racial stigma of being considered brown. Latinx voters in certain communities underwent a red shift, voting for anti-Latino candidate Donald Trump, even as the majority of the country underwent a blue shift, including, I should mention, many Latino communities, by the way, including in California, Arizona, Colorado, New York. So it's not an even picture. And I think sometimes the media presents, like, oh, Latinos are all Republicans now, and that's not the case. But there was a discernible shift in some areas. I have a lot of family in Nebraska, for instance, and there was a noticeable red shift in these rural communities in Western Nebraska that had largely been Democratic before the 2020 election. And while this red shift among Latinos still requires deeper political analysis to understand its nuances and dynamics, it seems to indicate a desire among some Latinos for closer political, economic, cultural, and even religious identification with whiteness. In light of this problem, I would like to discuss Guadalupe's image as it relates to race. Specifically, I want to highlight how the image has become a contested site for competing racial narratives in US society. I would then like to articulate an interpretive framework for her image that can help us to navigate these racial tensions. This framework that I want to propose is grounded in the relationship between Guadalupe and Juan Diego, using the ethical and aesthetic dimensions of their relationship to frame and interpret how images of Guadalupe are employed and deployed, including in relation to race. But first, some historical background. And some of you this might be old hat, but for others, it might be helpful and new, but at very least, it will help ground us all in kind of a common understanding of what I have in mind when I refer to the history of the Virgin of Guadalupe. The encounter between the Virgin of Guadalupe and Juan Diego is said to have taken place in 1531, though the earliest known written account was recorded more than a century later in 1648. Juan Diego, as the story goes, was drawn to the hill of Tepeyac, just outside of Mexico City. It's actually now a part of Mexico City, but at the time it was on the outskirts, where he found Guadalupe amid flower and song, which in the Nahua religious and philosophical worldview was associated with the divine or the heavenly realm. So she was surrounded by scintillating light and the sounds of chirping birds, and these beautiful sights and sounds drew him to her because he associated them with heaven. Guadalupe asks Juan Diego to petition the powerful Bishop Juan de Zumárraga to build a basilica in her honor at Tepeyac. Juan Diego initially demurs, feeling unworthy to petition the bishop due to his marginal status in the colonial society, relative especially to Zumárraga's position. Nevertheless, Guadalupe persists, eventually convincing Juan Diego that it is he, not a person of higher social status, nor one with more influence, who she wants to appear before the bishop on her behalf. This time, Guadalupe sends Juan Diego with his tilma, or cloak, full of roses grown in the frozen December earth on Tepeyac. Juan Diego presents the roses to the bishop as a sign of the veracity of his claims about Guadalupe's request, which the bishop had patently denied and rejected. When Juan Diego unfurls his lapfold to present the flowers, a brilliant image of the Virgin of Guadalupe appears embedded in his garment. Converted by this splendid image, the bishop finally believes Juan Diego's story and grants his request to build a basilica dedicated to La Virgen de Guadalupe. This composite narrative that I've outlined here for you echoes 4 central known accounts of the story composed by the so-called 4 Guadalupe evangelists, Miguel Sanchez, Luis Lasso de la Vega, Luis Bercerer Tanco, and Francisco de Florencia. Similar to the Gospels, each of their accounts is directed towards a particular community and audience. So when we think about the Gospels, you think, oh, Luke was written for this audience and John for that one. So same thing with the Guadalupe evangelists. For example, where Sanchez's account was primarily directed towards locally born Spaniards, criollos in Mexico City, Lasso de la Vega's account had the Nahua as well as colonial religious authorities who could read and converse in Nahuatl as its primary audience. So it was written for specifically the indigenous people, whereas Miguel Sanchez was writing for the Spanish who weren't from Spain, but who were born of Spanish parentage and lived in Mexico City. It is important to note, however, briefly, though, that the historical veracity of Guadalupe's appearance to Juan Diego has been contested by some scholars. Jesuit historian Stafford Poole, for example, asserts that theological interpretations, including liberationist theological interpretations, rely on inadequate or even erroneous historical foundations. He asks, are these indeed factual events, or are they legends of pious inventions? He argues that there is no historical documentation of the encounter between Guadalupe and Juan Diego during the time period when one would expect to find it. He asks if this is such a major event that happened in Mexico and really, shook the foundations of the society, you would expect there to be accounts written more closely to the time when the event actually happened. And yet, as I already said, it takes more than 100 years for these accounts to start appearing. Responding to Stafford Poole is Catholic theologian and historian Timothy Matavina. He's at Notre Dame University, or University of Notre Dame, sorry. And he argues that Poole does not appreciate the nature of the Guadalupe tradition's development, including its local and oral character, that it was transmitted in families and not necessarily written down. And it was transmitted among the indigenous people, not necessarily through a codex or a scroll, but through stories that were handed down. For this reason, Matavina rejects Poole's requirement for historical documentation from the 16th and early 17th centuries. And further, citing the continual development of the tradition from the early 16th century forward, Matavina rejects the demand for definitive proof of the apparition as justification for its use in Latinx and liberation theologies. I tend to concur with Matavina that the lived tradition of Guadalupe has developed over centuries of interpretation and practice. But it is this popular nature of the tradition, a tradition that literally, to borrow the words of esteemed San Diego theologian Orlando Espín, literally comes from the people, that allows it to defy simple, monolithic, uncontested meanings. The fact that it is an oral tradition passed down makes it very difficult to pin down the one certain meaning of this particular story. And this is also the case as it relates to the tradition and race. So a few thoughts on racial interpretations of Our Lady of Guadalupe to help ground this conversation on race a little bit more. As I've already mentioned, Our Lady of Guadalupe's image has been a crucial one for the formation of Mexican-American and Chicano racial identity in the United States, which has grappled with tensions between identifying as white and identifying as brown since at least the middle of the 20th century, if not since the 1920s. At mid-century, middle-class Mexican-Americans largely identified as white. Mexican-American associations such as the League of Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, And the American GI Forum strategically employed their government classification as white to pursue assimilation into white institutions, economic structures, and cultures that they believed would generate greater opportunities for advancement in the United States. And I keep this in mind. My grandmother, who, may she rest in peace, she passed away not this summer, but the summer before. She had always seen herself as being white, and yet her children, and myself included, we had kind of seen ourselves as brown and not being white and not fitting it with whiteness, and having experiences of racial hatred and discrimination leveled against us. So how did this shift happen, I think, is an important question to ask. But the strategic use of whiteness by these Mexican-American organizations backfired, both legally and socially, and led to losses both in the courtroom and in the culture. Nonetheless, the social movements of the 1960s and 70s shifted dynamics of Mexican-American identity, especially in relation to the Chicano movement. In conversation and cooperation with the Black civil rights movement and its activists at the time, Chicanos recast their understanding of their racial identity from white to brown. As Lauren Arazia, who's a scholar of social movements, writes in her analysis of the relationship between the Black and Chicano civil rights movement, she says, the ineffectiveness of the whiteness strategy coupled with the domestic and international movements of the 1960s led some Mexican Americans to develop a Chicano identity that rejected whiteness in favor of brown identity. And that's kind of how a lot of us were, who were raised in the 1960s on, kind of came to understand our own racial identities as brown, was within the context of the shift that's happening from within these social movements. Guadalupe's image was used to bolster this shift, both in religious and non-religious settings alike. In a Chicano parish in North Denver that coincidentally was called Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish, Father Jose Lara invited one of his parishioners, who was a Chicana muralist, to paint an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe behind the Eucharistic altar. He specifically instructed her to paint Guadalupe as a beautiful Chicana from North Denver. The resulting image has gorgeous brown skin and appears before San Juan Diego, also portrayed as having dark brown skin and indigenous features. Despite Guadalupe's role in the browning of Mexican-American identity, her symbol has also been leveraged in our society to defend and bolster whiteness. For example, the EWTN network, a prominent conservative Catholic media outlet that maybe many of us are aware of, maintains a web page on their site devoted to La Virgen de Guadalupe. But the explanation of her story is what one might call whitewashed. In the 16th century, it reads, the Blessed Virgin was moved with pity for the Aztec people who, living in the darkness of idolatry, offered their idols multitudes of human victims, deigned to take into her own hands the evangelization of these Indians, who were also her children. So we can kind of hear, even in this was the first sentence of, of their description of Guadalupe, that there's almost like a mindset of conquest, that Guadalupe's main purpose was not, to go and show San Juan Diego her love and respect and to lift him up. It was to conquer. And that's very, very important, because we, as we will see, there continues to be these themes of conquest in how her image is employed or deployed in relation to race. Their whitewashing continues in their portrayal of the conflict between Juan Diego and Bishop de Zumárraga. The bishop, a Franciscan, they write, the first bishop of Mexico, was a pious man full of zeal, who had a heart overflowing with kindness towards the Indians. He heard the poor man attentively, but fearing an illusion, did not put much faith in his story. So this is an awfully generous way of rendering what is described, at least in some of the accounts that that Bishop Zumárraga not only sent Juan Diego away, but he did so with suspicion, and he sent spies after him to make sure like he wasn't like getting into trouble or lying or whatever. Like they were really distrustful of him. So so again, I don't know if they've read the original accounts before they wrote this description for their website, but there seems to be, you know, this interest in making it clear that, oh, well, you know, Guadalupe supports the bishop. She doesn't undermine their authority, she bolsters it. Whereas one way to read the text is to say, actually, you know, she cautions that there should be some humility among the bishops, that the bishops don't always get it right, but eventually through listening to the Juan Diegos of the world, they might, right? The hope is that they could correct course, not that they, you know, oh, I'm so wise that I clearly understood what was going on. In any case, the rendering of the story by the EWTN not only downplays Guadalupe's specific decision to approach an indigenous person, an Indio, to deliver her message, it also demonizes the Nahua in the process. Read within the context of our current racial discourse, it shows at best, I think, a reluctance to acknowledge Brown dignity, but at worst, a triumphal narrative of conquest that undergirds contemporary manifestations of white supremacy. And I'm speaking to you from Charlottesville, Virginia today, so we know very well kind of what that white supremacist violence that's concerned that is oriented towards conquest looks like, you know, in real time. We saw white supremacists show up in our town in 2017 with weapons and homemade shields, and they were very much using the narratives of conquest and domination to say, we want to take this city back, using the language, you will not replace us. So I don't say these things to be bombastic or to you know, demonize the fine people of EWTN, but I do raise it as a scholarly question. What role do these narratives of conquest play in actual political movements today that are committed to white supremacy? And if one is partaking in that narrative, it might be important to ask these questions. What is this narrative of conquest doing in terms of how we envision those who are from non-white races in our society? Returning to this Chicano parish in North Denver for maybe an additional example here, in 2010, the Archbishop of Denver at the time, who was Charles Chaput, he's now in Philadelphia, he upheld a decision by the church's new pastor to build a white wall in front of this mural, this, in my opinion, very beautiful mural of Our Lady of Guadalupe, painted as North Denver Chicana. He ordered it to be covered up, and the bishop stood by his decision. The pastor was concerned that the image was a distraction from the true meaning of the Eucharist. The parishioners, especially the longtime Chicano parishioners, protested the decision, making appeals to their bishop with the hope that the story of Guadalupe's lifting up the lowly through Juan Diego would move his hearts and minds and change his decision. But their appeals were denied. The mural is now hidden literally behind a white wall and has become a makeshift utility room. She's now known by parishioners and longtime members of the neighborhood as Our Lady of the Broom Closet, which I think is a sad fate for such a beautiful image. And yet, if we take her story of identification with Juan Diego seriously, it might make sense that we would find an image of a virgin with indigenous features and dark brown skin, not in an exalted place, but in a utility room where only the church janitor can see her. How might the resources available to theologians and scholars of religion help us to navigate these contested interpretations of Guadalupe? I would like to offer a framework for interpreting Our Lady of Guadalupe that is predicated on her relationship with Juan Diego, not her relationship with the bishop, but her relationship with Juan Diego. At once both ethical and aesthetic, this framework that I'd like to offer gives concrete guidance for how we might literally see images of Guadalupe and references to Guadalupe, which are increasingly ubiquitous in their invocation in our society, how we might see these images in light of the centrality of her encounter with Juan Diego on Tepeyac. Theologian Roberto Goizueta offers vital analysis for constructing such a framework. To some, and I haven't looked through the list, so I don't know if there's any of my colleagues from the theology department in here, so they might be more aware of this this debate. And I pardon me for boring you if you hear hi, hi, Dr. Reamer Berry. To some, Goizueta's work may seem like an unlikely instrument for this task. His theology has been accused of contributing to what some Latino theologians have called an aesthetic turn. And this turn in Latinx theology has been criticized for focusing too narrowly on issues of cultural marginalization and empowering people within the culture, and neglecting emphasis on social issues and structure and issues of structural injustice, such as poverty and violence. That they're perhaps more prominent, and these things are perhaps more prominent in Latin American liberation theologies. These critiques highlight the risks of sundering or separating aesthetics from ethics, the consideration of the beautiful with the consideration of the ethical, cautioning against overemphasis on aesthetics for fear that it will lead to the neglect of crucial ethical and political questions in Latinx theology. Nevertheless, I contend that Goizueta's interpretation of the ethical relationship between Guadalupe and Juan Diego, especially in his 1999 book called Caminemos con Jesus from Orbis Books, is essential for mapping this interpretive framework that I'd like to outline today. Specifically, Goizueta's exposition of the encounter between Guadalupe and Juan Diego illustrates Juan Diego's realization of his own personhood in the context of colonial society, where he had once viewed himself as the lowliest of the low. His encounter with Guadalupe makes him aware of his own dignity and power in a way that he had not yet imagined. This realization, I argue, is accomplished through both the ethical and aesthetic features of their encounter. Ethically, Juan Diego's interaction with Guadalupe helps him come to understand himself. Sorry, page flip. Helps him to come to understand himself as both an autonomous person capable of making decisions about his own life, while also becoming increasingly aware of his ethical obligations to others, to those with whom he is most closely related and with his entire society. Being sent to the bishop on Guadalupe's behalf, Juan Diego comes to see himself not simply as he says, one who is governed, but one who has agency in relation to the powerful colonial church authorities of his time. Goizueta also observes that Guadalupe treats Juan Diego as an equal within the context of their relationship. Although she has instructed him to approach the bishop on her behalf in hopes that he will, she does not force him to do so. So when you go back and you listen to the story, there's no compulsion, there's no requirement that he go and do so, which is very interesting because this mirrors the Virgin Mary's own call to bear the Christ child. She is not forced to do so. God asks her and she says yes, right? So it's not a conquest, it's not a compulsion, it's something that is rendered as an invitation and accepted, thus respecting their agency in the process. When Juan Diego returns dejected and disempowered after his first attempt to persuade the bishop to build the basilica, Guadalupe simply asks him to do it again. And after yet another experience of rejection and suspicion from the bishop, and this is where the spying happens, which again, you should go back and pay attention to this part of the story. Juan Diego discovers that his Theo, his uncle, is ill, and that he must care for his uncle he decides that he must care for his uncle rather than obey the beautiful lady. The decision demonstrates Juan Diego's awareness of his responsibility to his family, which is his central community, even as he continues to navigate his relationship with Guadalupe and the church. As Goizueta explains, ironically, Juan Diego's willingness to disobey Mary is a sign that he is indeed a person with needs and desires that cannot simply be subsumed within someone else's, not even Mary herself. And I would add, not even Mary, whom he loves herself. So even his decision to disobey is not done out of a decision to say, well, and I don't love you, I don't want to respect you. It's done because there are these competing tensions of relationship. And Guadalupe seems to acknowledge that and know that Juan Diego is trying to care for his uncle while also doing this really big thing that she's inviting him to do. Instead of compelling or forcing Juan Diego to comply with her requests, Guadalupe appeals to him as one possessing agency that ought to be respected. Their relationship thus models the necessity of respect for both the autonomous and relational aspects of who we are as people and that are attendant in all of our relationships. In addition to the ethical features of their encounter, the aesthetic dimensions are significant as well. When Guadalupe approaches Juan Diego, as I've already mentioned, she does so not simply through discourse or arguments. Rather, she entices him with flower and song. She appeals to him with dazzling sights, sounds, and scents, calling him to the top of the hill at Tepeyac. Guadalupe acknowledges his capacity for aesthetic experience in general and his ability to perceive divine beauty in particular. Juan Diego, who is moved to go to the peak of Tepeyac through flower and song, is invited to an encounter with Guadalupe that generates deep joy and delight. It is through this aesthetic encounter with beauty that he learns of his own dignity, as translated in the Nikan Mopahua. Guadalupe testifies that Juan Diego is dignified and is her beloved child. This affirmation, expressed through the aesthetic experience of flower and song, convicts Juan Diego of his own worth and capacity. Thus, through his relationship with Guadalupe, Juan Diego comes to see himself as worthy of speaking on her behalf to the bishop, but also worthy of social dignity and respect. Goizueta's ethical and aesthetic analysis of this encounter between Guadalupe and Juan Diego offers a stepping stone for articulating a framework for navigating these contested interpretations of Guadalupe's symbol and narrative that I mentioned at the outset of my remarks. Although the symbol can be manipulated to support conflicting ends, including some unjust ends, and I won't weigh in too much on what's just and unjust among these ends, but let's just say, I think that the use of Guadalupe's symbol by like a major bank in Mexico is probably not in the spirit of what the story actually shares with us, in the same way that the use of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta in the United Farm Workers is. But we, if we had an entire week, we could get into all of that. So maybe not enough time for today. Foregrounding the relationship between Guadalupe and Juan Diego allows us to identify an efficacious framework for evaluating the symbol's various deployments. One question we might ask ourselves as we examine an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, any image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, look, if there's one in your wallet or one on your wall or one in your church, you can ask these questions of yourself. Where is Juan Diego? Not where is Carmen Sandiego? Where is Juan Diego? For some images of Guadalupe, the answer to this question is visible and evident. There he is. Juan Diego is literally depicted in the image itself, either hiking up Tepeyac or being dazzled by Guadalupe's beauty or kneeling before Guadalupe with reverence and awe. In other images, Juan Diego is not directly depicted. It is thus incumbent upon us as the interpreters to discern Juan Diego's presence or absence in an image where he does not appear. So to illustrate this, imagine with me two images. For the first, imagine a painting of Guadalupe depicted to appear as a beautiful Chicana woman. She has dark brown skin, perhaps even a shade or two darker than the image that we associate with the original Tilma image. Imagine now that the image further reinterprets the original by depicting a newborn baby in her arms rather than in her womb. Perhaps she is swaddling this baby, perhaps she is nursing the baby. But in the lowliness of Maria Guadalupe in this depiction, we are able to discern the presence of something of Juan Diego's lowliness as well. There's something about this image, and even though he's not there, there's something that suggests his presence, even in his absence. We see a woman with dark brown skin, one who is perhaps despised by her society for how she appears, or even despised by her own people for being too dark. We see a little baby, one who is profoundly vulnerable, one who needs constant care from his mother, one who is truly lowly. Perhaps the image reminds us and calls to mind images of other Mexican mothers with dark brown skin and indigenous features who have been separated from their young children, even as their parental tenderness remains crucial for the survival of these young children. Juan Diego is not in this image in an explicit way, but we might come to recognize his presence even in his absence. And in locating him in the image, we come to recognize both his vulnerability, but also his inherent dignity. In this way, locating Juan Diego in the image allows us to connect it to the pursuit of justice, including racial justice in our society. It allows us to remain mindful of Juan Diego as we gaze at the image, one who has been despised by his society. And it thus helps us to ascertain the duty of cultivating solidarity with him and all other Juan Diegos in our society, wherever we find them, wherever they may be. And even, again, I'll reference my own location here in Charlottesville again, in the days leading up to the Unite the Right rally, where specifically the lives of my Black and Jewish neighbors were under threat. I found myself turning constantly to Guadalupe, not because, she is a symbol that belongs to either of these communities, but because in my mind, the threat of violence for my neighbors, in my mind, gave me the ethical duties that I have to Juan Diego in response to them. And she really inspired both what I did on those days, but also what I've done in response. And I think what our community has done in response to the threats and the kind of the revelation of the full face of white supremacy in our own city. Now, I would like for you to imagine a second image. Let us now imagine a printed image of Guadalupe. This one is perhaps more familiar to us. It is a near perfect replica of the one that is said to have appeared on Juan Diego's tilma when he appeared before the bishop. But the colors have been enhanced to make them more vibrant and eye-catching, even as La Morenita's brown skin seems to have been lightened a bit in either the editing or printing process. There are words printed below this image, a very familiar one to most of us, in bold yellow type that say, "God is pro-life, are you?" This image is perhaps more difficult to interpret than the previous one. I think a charitable interpretation might be that Juan Diego is represented by the preborn child who Guadalupe carries in the image. The fetus is as vulnerable as one can be, completely dependent on his mother in ways that continue to unveil themselves to us through the study of medicine, theology, ethics, and philosophy, and have transformed and been unveiled to us over the course of centuries and millennia. Nonetheless, this interpretation might not truly point us to Juan Diego. And here's why. The bookmark, for all of its, and again, let's be charitable, all of its genuine concern and earnestness for the cause of life, it does not recognize Guadalupe it does not seem to recognize that Guadalupe did not come to judge, shame, or command either Juan Diego or his people to obey her direction. She did not come to compel. She did not come to say, well, you're not pro-life like God. That was not her approach at all. As we discussed it, it was one of mutual respect and of conversation for conversion rather than compulsion for conversion. She came instead to lift up the lowly, to make them aware of their own agency, even as she heightens our awareness of our communal and relational responsibilities. Within this interpretive framework that foregrounds the relationship between Guadalupe and Juan Diego, it also seems necessary to raise questions about what narratives about race adhere to the presentation of Guadalupe in this particular image and in the pro-life movement in the United States writ large. She is presented here not as a symbol of empowerment, but as one of conquest. She is deployed to conquer any opponent of this specific political movement. In this way, the interpretive logic asserted by this image is resonant with the interpretations of Guadalupe as conqueror leveraged by EWTN that I referenced earlier in the talk. The image also leaves very little room to the imagination as to how the pro-life movement might envision the relationship between itself and the movements for racial justice. At what point can they intersect? At what point can the power of this image reorient thinking, or must it be done kind of in a legalistic way, in a way that emphasizes the conquering of the enemy rather than lifting up the lowly? So mindful of time and really curious about your questions, I think I'm going to wrap up here. But what I do want to leave us with is this question of what might help us to interpret this image of Our Lady of Guadalupe in a way that helps us to more deeply understand its meaning, especially in light of all these contested meanings, all of these different uses. And I have argued here that we must answer by this question by asking, where is Juan Diego in this image? But I'm also really excited to hear if you have any thoughts yourselves, any disagreements, comments, questions. So for now, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and let's chat.
Thank you very much, Nichole. We
You're
appreciate
welcome.
your presentation, and we will open it up now to the people on Zoom and the few people we have here live. So if you have a question on Zoom, if you would send it to me in chat, and then I will unmute you and you can ask your question to Nichole.
Hey, Nichole, I'm Michael. I'm here at USD. I have a question to kick us off while some people are starting. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting and enlightening. My question, though, is I wonder, have you thought about the ways in which what might be happening with Guadalupe today is similar and or different to what maybe happened with other images of Mary in previous generations, the way in which she's now presented so often with very, very white skin and blue eyes in a way that historically doesn't resonate? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't thought in a really disciplined way about that as a scholar, but as like a faithful Catholic, I have noticed that kind of shift that has happened in some of these traditions. And one of the interesting ways that Catholic theology and Catholic social thought can interface, I think, with even just with American religious history as a broader category, is asking these questions of how have our patterns of migration and assimilation fueled that, or is this a specific U.S. phenomenon, or has it happened in other parts of the world in ways that that are interesting? Are there any counterexamples of Mary becoming darker, or Black images of Mary that belong to primarily identifiably white societies? I think it's a really important question. I have not, I feel that I should be responsible as a scholar and say that I haven't done my homework on that yet, but that's, I've taken note of it because I think it's a really provocative question.
Thank you. I have a question. You talked earlier about the generation that saw themselves as white, Mexican Americans saw themselves as white, and then the next generation saw themselves more as brown. What was the impact on the devotions to Guadalupe, but to others as well, as a result of that shift or the difference understanding?
Another excellent, genuinely excellent question. So I think it's important to underscore that a lot of this thinking of oneself as being white was located in middle-class Mexican American contexts. So I think specifically of my own grandmother, who was a poor, undocumented immigrant working cornfields in Nebraska, didn't necessarily see herself in kind of a racialized framework in the same way as my grandmother, who was an American citizen, who was middle class, was doing it. But I think to the question about devotions, it's an important one because, of course, devotion to La Virgen de Guadalupe is an intergenerational, and it's happened over now centuries. So how race has figured or not into that devotion, I think, is a really important question to consider and to hold on to. And I think it's important to also note that, and I didn't say too much about this in the talk, but in addition to Chicano Catholics really, finding resonance with Guadalupe as brown, a broader, even secularized Chicano movement also saw a lot and continues to see, insofar as the Chicano movement still exists as a thing. It's really transformed and become multiple other things in some ways, but has also found resonance for the grounding of its own racial identity in Guadalupe. But that in itself doesn't necessarily, mean that everyone has found that meaning in her. Thank you for the question. That's very rich.
Thank you. Emily, do you have a question? I'll mute you if you do. I can see you.
Do you want me to unmute myself?
Oh, you're unmuted. Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Well, let me start by thanking you, Dr. Flores, for such an enriching lecture. And I have your book, and your book is brilliant. And so I want to recommend that others buy and read your book.
Could you hold the book up again? Could you hold the book up again so that you can see it on the screen?
Proof.
There you go. Okay.
It
Perfect.
exists.
Thank you.
The real book.
Okay. Thank you.
So I keep thinking of the image of the Virgin of the Broom Closet that you talked about as a metaphor for how clerical power can be abusive in parish spaces. And as a white listener, I'm wondering if you could help me think through my responsibility as an ally in a situation like that, where I can work in patterns of resistance against that kind of abusive power. And I'm thinking especially of the section of your book about practical solidarity, and kind of the implications of practical solidarity together with aesthetic solidarity. I think it's an interesting distinction, but gosh, my heart sank when you talked about how the Virgin of the Broom Closet, like that she, or the white wall, kind of the whitewashing of this story, and yet thinking through my responsibility. So I wonder if you could help us kind of think through our opportunities and responsibilities given those kinds of really problematic uses of power in parish spaces.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it comes from the heart of someone who I know both personally, but also as a scholar and a theologian, has try to orient your life towards this life of solidarity. So you're really the inspiration for a book about solidarity. So thank you for your witness and for your model. And I do think in terms of, well, actually, I'll take the second part of your question first, this relationship between aesthetic solidarity and practical solidarity. I think, of course, they're very close. And I think of the work of, in particular, of Maureen O'Connell, who also writes really compelling work on ethics and aesthetics in relation to solidarity. And in her work, she relies on the philosophy of John Dewey to show that there's a relationship both in making art and in viewing art, and they're slightly differentiated for him. They're not unrelated, but being the artist who makes and being the artist who perceives are two different things. So within this context of the white, you know, the being the white person in the parish with this power, maybe a disproportionate power to hold, you know, our pastors, and even beyond that, our diocesan figures accountable, is the act of seeing. It's, you know, this reception and this attentiveness. And I do talk about this in the book, and I didn't talk about it explicitly here, but it's definitely kind of undergirding what I'm thinking here, that there's this attentiveness to being mindful of not just what we see, but how we see it, and asking questions like, how is this undermining dignity? Or in the case of Guadalupe, you know, this question that I asked need not only be applied to images of Guadalupe, but it's an ethical question as well. Where is Juan Diego? And if there is either his absence or he's being made invisible, literally being hidden in a closet, literally not being lifted up within the community, that the first thing is to notice and attend to that, which sounds kind of simple and maybe, you know, a little bit normcore, but I think that's such an important movement, because if we don't realize that, if we don't literally see, then that's a problem. So seeing is a part of it, but also to your point about practicing, I think that there's so much that still needs to be done in terms of how parishioners, especially those with disproportionate amounts of power, exercise that power and influence within parish communities. And I say this from the perspective of someone who loves her parish, but it's a very white parish, and the power structure is very hard to crack, if you will. That it's not at all evident that, you know, there's one model for every parish. I think it really depends on where one finds herself or himself or themselves in the parish, and what the particular issues are there. But I do think that both these practices of attention, but also being willing to enter this space of creating and trying to envision something new with the community, is one important aspect of holding accountable structures of power and authority. So thinking of Bishop Zumarraga in relation to Juan Diego, for example, a part of that work that happens on him, you know, contra what EWTN is like, oh, he just had the purest heart of gold. He just loved Indians. It was good. Like, they're not even being fair to him, because what happens to Zumarraga is actually really even more remarkable when you think about it in relation to the conversion he has in this encounter with Juan Diego. But it was, you know, Juan Diego was making appeal after appeal after appeal to a point where he was just burnt out. But also it's this encounter with beauty and the encounter with the story that really does make the difference. It really does convert him. So I implore, if there's any like executives for EWTN on this call, like, go and revise that page, because it's a much richer story than it's being given credit for right now. Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Dr. Reamer-Berry, for your great question.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and let's see. I lost the question now. Sorry, but let me ask the last question. There's an image in New Mexico that's very popular in Santa Fe, La Conquistadora. Would you like to comment on that a little bit?
Yeah. So one direction, so as both Jeffrey's mentioned and Dr. Remer-Berry have mentioned, I've completed this book project, and what you heard today was kind of me trying to get a little bit deeper and go a little bit deeper for a future project into thinking about race and in relation to Guadalupe. So you're hearing new work here. It's building on old work, but you're hearing new work today. And one of the questions that I have is about this image of conquest, because Guadalupe, of course, has been used as a symbol of conquest. As I mentioned at the outset of the talk, she was also the image of revolution for Miguel Hidalgo, and was on their battle standard or their war flag as they were marching into battle. So it hasn't been this image that has just been associated with economic and social justice causes, for example. So a part of what I'm interested in doing is developing a even richer way of viewing these images and trying to make sense of how we can, as I was indicating at the end of the talk, make sense of both presence and absence within images. I've been consulting the work of people working within iconoclasm, actually, to think about this, because one of the risks of asking critical aesthetic questions about Guadalupe is that we start smashing images, right? So do I really want to smash the image of Guadalupe on that bookmark? No, because I think that, again, that that's perhaps misunderstanding how an image mediates truth to us, and how it mediates beauty and goodness as well. So there's that, but they're having a mechanism for asking better questions about how we interpret an image, and what the hard, what kind of hard truths we discover, and asking those questions, how they inform our understanding of the Catholic faith, I think is really important. So without being too specific about the image of conquest, I think, I definitely want to ask my favorite question of where is Juan Diego in this image, but also I want to be open and attend to what this image, the history of this image, and who made it, how was it made, why was it used in this way, and to have as much as there's a hermeneutic of critique or suspicion, to have one of charity that says how this image, especially as a holy image, is so much more complex than I can possibly kind of nail down with my one little theologian mind, and be open to the mystery that is opening in that image, and perhaps that can help us to understand more fully how it relates to what is happening with racial identity in the United States in general, but certainly with Latino racial identity today.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Dr. Flores, for a very interesting, compelling presentation. It's raised a lot of good questions for us. Thank you for your good work. And so thank you to all of you who have attended today. This event was brought to you by the Harp Center for Catholic Thought and Culture and Mission Integration here at the University of San Diego. Next week, we have Marie Dennis of Pax Christi International, who will be speaking about peace and nonviolence in the Catholic Church today. Same time, same place. So hopefully we'll see some of you next week. Once again, thank you very much. Thank you to all who attended. And if you want to hang around, I'm going to unmute everyone and you can talk for a few minutes if you would like.
Thank you. Yay. Thanks, everyone. Good to see you.
You have to go though. So
it's okay to go if you need to go.
yeah, okay.
Eventually I need to hop off and go get my kiddo from daycare because it's late in the day here.
Right,
But...
yeah, that's right. Yeah. So,
That was brilliant, Nichole. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you so much for reading the book. I am sure you can see the places where it jumps off, but it's also I'm writing a book chapter right now for a volume called Saints and Divided Societies that's specifically on Guadalupean race. So this is like me trying to, play around with these ideas, get a good sense of what's resonating. Like the questions about like, what do you do with this image of conquest is actually like really like that's the growing edge of the work right now. So I'm just deeply grateful for, having a good conversation about it right now.
Yeah, really exciting.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
you're doing.
I love that
doing-
the phrase that Guadalupe did not come to coerce, but she was
Mhm.
affirming him in relationship, and that affirming his agency. I just think you brought out so many important themes that resonate with other questions, but especially with the
Yeah.
non-coercive element, but that it's invitational, it's through a